It's interesting to me. I think we tend to summarize very sloppily the Old Testament story in a way that kind of edits out diversity. And so it's just like, oh, this is the family of Abraham, and they're all one nationality, one ethnicity, but there's just stories all the way through where other people marry in. So I think hiding right in plain sight is the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh, who are Joseph's sons, get promoted to being sons of Jacob, so that 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel are the sons of Joseph, who married an Egyptian woman who is the daughter of a priest. And so there's two leaders of the tribes are half Egyptian. So from the very beginning. And go back to Judah, Judah himself, the only reason his family line survives is because he is tricked into sleeping with his Canaanite daughter-in-law. So the tribe of Judah is half Canaanite from the beginning. Yeah.
That's a mess. That's a mess. What a mess. That's a lot. Mess. That's a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome. Bienvenue chez episode 95. That's episode 95 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. Guys, there's been a couple of repeat guests so far on the almost century of podcast episodes, but none, possibly none, as heartwarming to me as Carmen Imes. I was able to have a conversation with Carmen Joy Imes. I think this is maybe 5 years ago now. On her first book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. And this actually with my friend Jeremy on a different podcast that he was hosting at the time. And then when I had the opportunity to launch my own, I had a conversation with her, an official one on this podcast feed for this book, Being God's Image. It was actually on the day, as you'll hear, on the day that the manuscript was actually sent into her publisher. We had a conversation on that very same day. So long before the book was actually released, but we talked about, being the image of God. And I'm a multi-officed person, and so I do not have this other book with me right now, but what we're going to be talking about today on her kind of second official, third unofficial stop on the Jolly Thoughts podcast is about her third book in her epic trilogy, Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters. And we talk about some other things as well. A couple spicy takes, some hot takes, but mostly just some excellent wisdom from Carmen Imes about, why the church might still matter today. And maybe you're like, I'm convinced I'm in, you don't need to convince me. But the truth is that a lot of people, they don't necessarily see a lot of value in quote unquote the church, whether we think the institution of the church, whether we think just the gathering of local people, kind of Lone Ranger Christianity or Lone Ranger spirituality is, or a la carte spirituality. These are all things. So I think that in this book and in this conversation, you'll hear glimpses of it. Dr. Imes does some incredible work to try to build a case for why the church still matters. It's a conversation near and dear to my heart, and I've learned so much from Carmen over the years, and I'm really, really grateful to have been able to learn more from her in this instance. So without any further ado, your friend and mine, Dr. Carmen Joy Imes. I think we spoke in 2020, maybe about bearing God's name, why Sinai still matters. And then we're going to choose to talk about, even though it was in advance of the book release, but it was really about the content of the being God's image. And I was even just today, it just ended up being in my feed today. I was listening to your John Dixon episode on deceptions. And I was like, and it was funny being able to hear that, based upon when we chatted, 4 years ago.
Am I still saying the same things 4 years later?
Yeah, but more clearly, do you know what I mean? Or more, more confidently and succinctly, probably because you've been. I can't imagine the ringer that you have to go through.
I've just practiced it lots of times now with lots of different audiences, so I have certain things that I know that land well. So that would make sense.
Yeah, and so here we are now talking about a book that came out last year called "Becoming God's Family," why the church still matters. So it was if I'm keeping it straight, so it's bearing God's name, which is
Bearing
why
God's name.
Sinai still matters,
Mhm.
and then being God's image, that's why creation still matters. Is that right? And then it's becoming God's family, why the church still matters. And Esau McCulley in his foreword was like, basically comparing it to all the greatest trilogies in the world, like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, and just all the amazing.
He's nice.
Yes, God bless him. But it is great. I was able to be part of a reading group that read it early.
Yeah.
I listened to it early. Actually, I listened to the audiobook and then kind of made some notes as going along. So I always love when the audiobook is read by the person. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too.
So what's the boilerplate like? What's the elevator pitch? So if you're gonna what is this book ultimately about?
I am trying to make the case that the Christian life was never meant for us to do solo, that when we place our faith in Jesus, we're incorporated into a family. And so becoming part of a church is important for our own spiritual growth. We can't be all we're meant to be without each other. And it seemed to me that we needed to make a case for this again. When I was growing up, there was never a question in my household about whether we would go to church on a Sunday. I don't remember a single time we sat around the breakfast table on a Sunday morning and said, should we go? Like, I don't know. Do you guys feel like going? That was never a question. We just obviously we're going to go to church. And I don't think that's true anymore for most Christian families. Like it's kind of like, if we have the bandwidth, if we have the energy, if there's nothing else on the schedule, we might go. And so I'm wanting to help people see why this should come back to the top of the priority list and what we're missing if we don't.
That's good. But you don't necessarily just mean worship service attendance.
No, it's bigger than that. But I think that's like the central hub of what it means to become part of the church, is showing up together where we're going to corporately worship, hear the word preached, wait for God to show up and act, participate in his work. It spills out into the other days of the week, but that's kind of the center of gravity, I would think.
Sure. It's like if your family had family meals and you said like, oh, I still want to be a vibrant and active part of this family, I just have no intentions of showing up at grandma's on Sunday afternoon or whatever, then they would be like, okay, but that's kind of weird. Like
that's like that's how you become a vibrant member of this family. That's where all the stories get told and where all the connections happen.
Right.
Yeah.
So near the very beginning of the book, I want to kind of, you've been talking about this for a long time now, so I'm not, people can look at any number of podcasts, appearances that you've been on, and there's great resources that come with this book as well. But I want to splash into the kind of the deeper end of things a little bit here, right off the gate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Near the beginning, you suggest that the birth of the church is actually not connected to, Acts chapter 2, which is a narrative that I'm used to hearing. So actually, kind of one of my kind of current favorite worship songs is the song "King of Kings," and it's got that beautiful, how those hymn songs are kind of laid out, so that you get to that third or fourth verse, and everything's going nuts. And that one has and the Church of Christ was born,
yeah,
and the Spirit lit the flame. Right, that's kind of like it's like a beautiful little kind of poetic turn of phrase that immediately brings you back to this kind of vision. Which is what we often talk about, which is that, sure, the disciples had walked with Jesus and whatnot, but when the Spirit comes upon them, that's when the church, in some respects, is born. And so this isn't a conversation about the Spirit or not the Spirit, but this is a conversation about what do we mean by the church. And so I know that you've often, you're building a case for why the church, and therefore why the people of God, maybe I'll let you kind of fill in the blanks if I'm filling it in wrong, but like the congregation, why that matters, not individually, but corporately, the individuals as part of the corporate. And so, but you are an Old Testament, I mean, certainly you know the Bible quite well, but you're an Old Testament scholar. That's your bailiwick. And so it is interesting that this is laid out primarily about stories from the Old Testament, which is kind of like it's a weird, an unusual way to think about.
You can call me weird, Mark. It's okay. it's not the first time.
And so I'm sure that, because I mean, you make the claim I think it's the introduction. You make the claim about this, whatever, and then I'm betting, I don't know. I think most of the time, you write the introduction afterwards in some respects, or I don't know. But
Oh,
anyway, you've already built out the
yeah.
case. You know, you've
Yeah.
got all these examples throughout, and you follow through. You have tons of examples from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But how is it that we can say the people of God, like the church, that word?
Mm-hmm.
How can we say that that's an entity kind of
Mm-hmm.
prior to,
Yeah.
not even just prior to Pentecost, but prior to Christ and his
Yeah.
kind of incarnation? How
Yeah.
do you think that through?
I mean, I think just very basically, we have the word ecclesia in the New Testament, which is the Greek word that's translated church, is what the people of God are called when they're gathered at Mount Sinai. They're the assembly of God's people. So if you're just going to do a word study, you have to trace it all the way back into the Old Testament. Every time the people of God gather around his presence, this word can show up. So that's part of it. But also, I feel like the New Testament authors consistently describe the church in ways using titles and metaphors that have a long history in the Old Testament. In other words, their point is not, you guys are doing something completely new, but you have now, so you being Gentile believers in Jesus have been grafted in to this covenant tree. You've been incorporated into this covenant family. You now have a place where you didn't have a place before. So there's constantly language being used that comes from the Old Testament to describe the church. And so I guess I would say, yeah, there is something really special that happens in Acts chapter 2, and Pentecost is important. And every time I talk about this in churches, we start with Pentecost and we lean into this, like, what's going on when the Spirit falls, when the flames come on their heads. There's like tongues of fire on their heads. What is this supposed to mean? And they even ask it in that moment, what does this mean? And to find out what it means, you have to go back to the Old Testament and see all the places where the Spirit falls, or the glory of God shows up as fire among the gathered community. And that incidents where that happens punctuate the entire Old Testament story. So yes, many people will find it odd that to pick up a book on the church and have 3/4 of it be in the Old Testament. But this book, like the others in the trilogy, is a work of biblical theology where I'm trying to trace a theme through the whole Bible. And this time the theme is what happens when we gather together around the presence of God. And that's happening from the beginning, but really in a powerful way at Sinai. And then as the tabernacle is built and as the temple is built, this is where we can learn a lot.
For sure. And my eyes were open to see all kinds of things, a number of which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go here. But has anybody said, if all we do is use the same word and then kind of, I'm going to say kind of retroactively read it back into the text? Because it's funny, I was reading it just in my regular reading this morning. I was reading Psalm 74, and it said the word, the congregation,
Yeah.
in my ESV book, my ESV Bible,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
And actually I meant to, and to get a chance to look it up, but I was like, dollars to donuts. If that was in the Septuagint, I was like, it's probably ecclesia. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. It probably is.
I'll look it up right now.
In real time. Yeah. Okay. But that would be in the Greek translation anyway. It wouldn't be in the, which, we can, and people will quibble about,
right.
Maybe the Greek actually is older than the Masoretic tradition. Doesn't really matter. But the point is that, so even like the word itself isn't always enough to actually carry the semantic load. Right. So like,
right.
if I use the word like, man, I went to church last night when I went to a Beyonce concert.
Yeah.
That won't mean that I went to a worship service that's centered around the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, like, if we think about a community that's gathered around, I think of the church as being a community that's gathered around Jesus Christ. I know that to the degree that he's part of the Trinity, then it is also around God the Father and the Spirit. But the idea of trying to think of that same kind of entity, kind of pre-BC, or just BC, I guess.
BC, before Christ,
the peanut butter and so, but before that, does that seem like anybody could be saying, like, I'm going to use the word supersessionism, even though I don't really always know what people mean when they say that. But I'm wondering, has anybody said to you, Carmen, it kind of sounds like you're almost trying to supersede the idea that like the church becomes Israel, or the church
No,
kind of moves backwards into Israel in some respects, or
no one has said that to me, but maybe people are just nice and they just don't want to pick a fight. I don't know. I would actually think it's the opposite. If
okay.
we're going to say the church is this brand new thing in Acts chapter 2, like that's a way of saying like we're done with all that stuff God tried in the Old Testament. That's dead and over, and now God's up to something entirely different that is going to work this time, because it's not with the Jews, it's with everybody. And
Right.
that to me seems supersessionist, and that's partly why I'm trying to draw the lines of continuity with the Old Testament people of God, because the whole point of Jesus coming in the flesh is to tabernacle among us. It's God taking on human flesh to live in our neighborhood, to fully experience what we experience so he can meet us on our turf. And that's what happened at Sinai in a different way, right? Like God comes down Mount Sinai and dwells among his people as they build the tabernacle. And so for the Gospel of John to refer to Jesus as tabernacling among us is saying the Christ event is not, it's new, and it's exponentially better than what we had before because
Mhm.
he's embodied among us, but it's still the same principle of what happened at Sinai, where God said, "You're my people, I'm your God, and I'm going to dwell among you." And I just heard Michael Morales just made a point, I think this morning on X. He says the covenant formula is often summarized as, "I will be your God and you will be my people." I have done that myself in print, I'm sure many times, like especially in bearing God's name. That I thought that was the covenant formula. He says, no, that's only 2/3 of it. It's, "I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell among you." It's not just like a distant, like you're mine, but I'm going to be way up here. It's no, I'm going to dwell among you. And I agree. Now that he said it, it seems obvious.
Mm.
This is the concern of the book of Exodus and Leviticus. Then I will dwell among you. And because I've been hanging out in the tabernacle instructions for a whole year, trying to translate them and understand them, and like it seems to me central to God's relationship with his people that he's decided he wants to be with us, and that's what Christ is doing, and that's what's happening on the day of Pentecost is God's presence dwelling among us again, just like in the tabernacle and the temple, only now it's among the gathered people,
Mhm.
sans building. uh,
Right.
the building itself is not important anymore. It's the people gathered around the presence of God. So it seems to me too obvious. The lines of continuity are too obvious to ignore.
I appreciate you clarifying it that way, saying that leaning into the continuity is not necessarily a way of making the former things unimportant, but
Yeah,
actually to kind of make them more important,
yeah,
or
yeah,
to make them important. I
yeah,
guess in
yeah.
other words, like often when I end up talking about this to like membership classes or discipleship classes, we'll often end up describing like
Mm-hmm,
the tree of the church, right?
mm-hmm,
And then we'll talk about the soil and the roots kind of
mm-hmm,
together
mm-hmm.
being what we read of essentially in Leviticus
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Exodus or whatever. So there is this like it's not actually, you can't have the tree without the root system. Like it's
No,
just not
no.
possible.
Yeah,
Um, but I do still, I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around, we talk about it, whether it will seem to, if I were a Jewish listener, I guess, I'd be like, I wonder if they're saying that we're, I don't know, it feels like, I don't know, like they're appropriating like our
yeah,
texts from, I mean, obviously
yeah.
that's going to be a
Sure.
problem for them in some respects, but that's not something that we can kind of
Yeah, I do
control.
think I
But
would want to say we haven't replaced Israel. We're being incorporated with them into the covenant, and Israel, covenant faithfulness is defined in not in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of obedience and surrender, just like it always has. So that there is a sense in which being Jewish is not enough. Being of Jewish descent is not enough. You need to be rightly related to God through Torah obedience, through trusting in Him for salvation. That's something that we see, I think, from the beginning. And that's a point that I make in the first book, which you and I probably talked about years ago now. Um, is that the Old Testament law was not the means by which the Israelites got saved. God rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He claimed them as his own before they ever had the law. So the law isn't how you get saved, it's how you fulfill your mission as his people. And it seems to me we've inherited that same mission, or we're being incorporated into that same mission by faith in Jesus.
Yeah, and that book, I mean, I've loved your books. I've loved them all, but that one is I'll never get over reading that one for the first time. It kind of blew me away. But what you said just a moment ago too is like, you make a great case in the book for this idea of an expansive, people of God that are actually kind of, like you said, not just genetically related, but actually related in a sense of how we live is actually, again, not brand new. So there's a quote on page 30 where you say, from the beginning, the Israelites were a multi-ethnic family whose most prominent members often married foreigners. Later laws against intermarriage are focused exclusively on protecting Israelite worship rather than trying to maintain the purity of the Israelite bloodline. And I would love to hear you expound a little bit more upon that, because I'm often running into people where I'm hearing things like, well, they'll even talk about things like in a weird kind of side quest on this, which has the same impact. We'll talk about like things like Genesis 6 and what happens with, angels and watchers and who knows what's going on. But there is this genetic, like we think in terms of like DNA, like this, there is this weird kind of a scientism that we're locked into.
Yep.
And it's like, I don't know what's going on there, but I do know that, because if they'll talk about the idea of like kind of maintaining the purity of Israel, they will somehow in their head think, well, again, that's a genetic kind of transmutation. And it's like, but you do this wonderful job of pointing out, it's like, if that was a goal, it didn't work out.
It didn't work at all. And I think one way to see that is to look at every place where God prohibits intermarriage with foreigners and notice that he always explains the reason why I don't want you marrying Moabites or whatever is because they will draw you away from worshiping me and lead you into the worship of other gods. So the concern is always about religious worship, about sole allegiance to Yahweh and not to any other gods. And it's never about like that would pollute your bloodline. The only time we get language like that is in Ezra and Nehemiah, where they're not hearing a divine directive. They're just concerned about intermarriage, and they seem to have swapped. They don't seem to realize that God's concern with intermarriage was always about worship and never about blood. And so it's interesting to me. I think we tend to summarize very sloppily the Old Testament story in a way that kind of edits out diversity. And so it's just like, oh, this is the family of Abraham, and they're all one nationality, one ethnicity, but there's just stories all the way through where other people marry in. So I think hiding right in plain sight is the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh, who are Joseph's sons, get promoted to being sons of Jacob, so that 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel are the sons of Joseph, who married an Egyptian woman who is the daughter of a priest. And so there's two leaders of the tribes are half Egyptian. So from the very beginning. And we could go back to Judah. Judah himself, the only reason his family line survives is because he is tricked into sleeping with his Canaanite daughter-in-law. So the tribe of Judah is half Canaanite from the beginning.
Wait, hold on. Is it through her that his line is like, if you look at, oh, wow.
Yeah.
These are the problems. This is the problem with having genealogies.
Jesus is
they're
Canaanite.
so hard to read.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's a wild note. Yeah. And there's so many more of these, right? Like this is not an isolated incident.
Boaz is half Canaanite because his mom is Rahab, and Rahab, after she saves the spies, and then she's incorporated into the Israelite nation, and then she gives birth to Boaz. And why is Boaz so willing to consider that a Moabite woman might be godly and worthy of honor? Well, his mom is a Canaanite woman who has converted to the worship of Yahweh. So that seems to me that prepares him to accept a foreign woman in a way that maybe others wouldn't. Yeah.
That's a mess. What a mess. That's a lot. Mess. That's a lot. Yeah, that's crazy. But I think if you realize that, it really does come down to like it's encouraging. I think it should be encouraging because it's
Mhm.
like this, like, the idea we think, okay, well, the church is expansive, or at least the church should be expansive.
Yeah.
And so, but there is this kind of line though that I often end up discovering is some people want their church to just be, um,
They're people.
well, yes, some people do want that. They want the church to be locked down. So if we're looking at a bit of a, I don't know, a two-sidedness, there is like a just our people, but then there's also this kind of like, I've encountered, I don't know if you have, I bet you have encountered people who want their church to be open for everybody
Mhm.
with absolutely, not just no kind of limits, but no center. Like the
Mm.
center is belongingness.
Mm.
Like that's
Mhm.
what they want the
Mhm.
church to be about. And it's
Yeah.
like, but the church is actually about centering around the person
Yeah.
and work of Jesus
Yes.
Christ.
Yes, which is a call to holiness.
Yeah.
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 So I talk about this in the New Testament part of the book that, we could look at this theme of belonging in the Bible and how we become family and think, oh, it's open to everybody kind of with no limits or no boundaries. But the New Testament writers are very clear about who you should not fellowship with and who is not welcome at your table. And it's those who've not actually surrendered to the lordship of Jesus Christ, but they're trying to choose their own path that does not include obedience to God's commands. And so, although it's open to anyone, it's not open to everyone because you have to actually opt in to God's way of living.
Right. Which I think is, there's churches these days who are, and I'm a part of one. Like we are about radical openness. Like that's really the goal, is we
Yeah.
want it to be open to everybody.
Yeah.
But it does, however, like, so then when we talk about things like, okay, but what about church membership or whatever? And
Hmm.
then people are
Hmm.
like, well, I'm not a member. I'm like, oh no, you're welcome to be here.
Yeah.
Well, you can come anytime you want.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between coming and being kind of a committed member of the family or whatever.
Yeah. Yep.
And so having those kinds of, almost like, what's the word, where you circles within circles, whatever, where you're
Yep.
like, yeah, but
Yep.
you can get kind of closer towards, but we're actually kind of centering around. There's another radical claim that you have in this book, at least a few of them. You're very radical, but this one here, on page 14, you're saying that adoption language, so a language that Paul often uses about adoption,
Hmm.
is actually more for the benefit. I'm kind of putting language here. You can push back if it's wrong.
Hmm.
It's more about reorienting our horizontal relationships than it is about reorienting our vertical relationships. So in other words, like, it's
Hmm.
more about putting us in relationship with our brothers and sisters through adoption than it is about putting us into a relationship with God as our Father. Is that
Yeah.
what you're meaning to imply?
I don't remember pitting those two things against each other. I'll have to read what I said again.
Well, yeah, it's good. Check it out. Page
There is a
14.
sense in which so I argued in Being God's Image that to be the image of God implies kinship, that every human being is the image of God, and that implies kinship. So every human being then is a member of God's family already. But
Just
then the New
by
Testament,
virtue of them being created in His image, right? Okay.
created by God as His image.
As His image, yeah.
We have this almost like a biological relationship with God, because in chapter 5 of Genesis, it says that Adam gave birth to Seth, and Seth was Adam's image and his likeness. And so it uses that image language. And I don't think it's saying, see, Seth isn't the image of God anymore. He's only the image of his father, and he's fallen. And so we've lost the image. That's how some people read it. But based on Genesis 9, where God tells Noah that nobody's allowed to go around murdering people because all humankind is God's image, it seems to me the image is still intact. That hasn't been lost. But what we're getting in Genesis 5 is an analogy. We are the image of God, just like Seth is the image of Adam. So there's a kind of family resemblance or family membership, responsibility of representing the family, something that's inherent in every human being. But most human beings are estranged from God as their heavenly Father. And so there needs to be family reconciliation. And I think Paul chooses the language of adoption because it's the strongest language available to talk about this change of status that that the estrangement is over and people have been reconciled to God. So I think that's important that happens. And I guess what I want to say in the book is that, and maybe I didn't say it very clearly, is that this does have radical implications for horizontal relationships, because if you are my brother, if we're both adopted as God's children, then you are my brother. And at least in the first century, sibling language, the sibling relationship is the strongest relationship, the most intimate relationship there was.
Yeah, you did say this quite clearly, abrasively clearly.
even stronger than a husband and wife relationship would be siblings. So if my brother and my husband both wanted something from me, like they both required my services for something, and the two requests conflicted with one another, everyone would assume I'm going to go with brother, not husband.
Wow.
And that's just really interesting. I think part of that is probably because of age difference in marriages in that time. So it's less like we have fallen in love with each other. There's this romantic attraction and we're going to be friends for life. Like people didn't marry their friend. It was marriages were arranged because of what they would mean for the joining of families and social classes and all of that. So I think that's probably what contributes to that. And I'm not trying to suggest that we should pattern our culture after first century culture and like rethink how we do intimacy. But I do think that what this teaches us is that when Paul is writing about brothers and sisters in Christ, he's using sibling language to describe fellow believers. He's using the strongest language he has available to him to say how committed we need to be to one another, how loyal we should be to one another, how much we should show up for each other.
Right. Yeah. I think you communicate. I think you did communicate that in the book. So good job. Don't worry. I'm sure you did it right. I think the thing that struck me was, like, I'm reading here on page 14, biological children do not need to be adopted by their biological parents. So if all humanity is already part of God's family, like you said, adoption is not necessary. But adoption is happening here. So I'm now kind of deviated from it. And so kind of what I heard in that, maybe between the lines and maybe incorrectly, was that it's funny. I keep going back to worship songs. It's just what I do. But there's an older one called No Longer Slaves. And it has a line in there. It says, I just remember the line is, your blood flows through my veins. I can't remember the line before it, but it's your blood. And I remember people, a number of people approached me and be like, that's heresy. That's not right. That's, it's like, it's, we're adopted into God's family. We're not, and I was like, okay, I think I hear what you're saying, but I
think what happens in these conversations is that it's all a metaphor, right? The language of adoption, the language of being God's family, both of these are metaphors.
Right.
And we can't push metaphors too far, because then they stop working.
Yeah.
And I go on to say on page 14, Paul uses the metaphor of adoption to emphasize the dramatic reorientation of priorities and allegiances that come with membership in the family of faith. So while every human is already technically part of God's royal family, the task of discipleship is learning to live like it's true. And I think that is going to have both vertical and horizontal implications. For someone who's been estranged from their Heavenly Father, they need to radically rethink, okay, how do I spend my money? How do I make my decisions? How do I do my work? Now I'm doing it as a child of God. I was a child of God before, but now I'm actually leaning into that and organizing my life in that way. And then in the same way, now I have these siblings that I'm responsible to and for, and what does that mean?
Yeah, well, that's the slap in the face, I think, is the power of the metaphor is lost on us, probably. I think, and that's likely your point here is, we've heard a lot. I've heard a lot about how, now I am a child of God. Like that's the, whether it's, through some sort of genetics or whether it's through adoption.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's a beautiful, there's like, man, I'm a child of the King, right?
Yeah.
And that does have, good for us, but also it obviously has dramatic consequences in how we live, obviously.
Yeah.
But the sibling language is lost because, first of all, I'm an only child, but even if I weren't, most of us in our culture, hopefully we have close relationships with our siblings, but even if we didn't, even if we did, I don't think most of us feel beholden in any way to our siblings, right? We grow up, and as soon as we move out of the house, we become autonomous units. And
We
actually
do.
the marriage unit becomes the closed nuclear family marriage unit becomes the
Yeah.
defining. Like
Yeah.
when I think of how I'm going to serve my family, when I use that word, I mean my spouse and then my children
Right.
until they become independent members of society themselves. But
And
what we're
when you
seeing is,
say we, let's clarify that you mean those of us of white European descent. Because
maybe, yes,
I've
maybe.
got lots of friends who would say that is not at all how it works in my family. So this
Okay.
sort of independent autonomous units where when my children turn 18, they're kicked out of the nest and they're sent off to fend for themselves. I have a Hispanic friend who's like, Carmen, I would never do that to my children. I can't believe you would do that to your children. And I'm thinking like I'm doing what's right for them by saying
Sure.
it's time for you to move on.
Yeah.
So we have to recognize that every cultural context has a different sort of family system theory or family makeup. And so what I felt like really needed to happen in this book is to help white people like us understand this collectivist context. And we read the Bible as if it's written to us, and we just make assumptions about its values and what it's calling us to, as if it's speaking to individualists, helping us figure out how to live our best life now in sort of self-determination and autonomy. And we just miss all of these collective claims on what does it mean to be a family.
Yeah, that's good. That would be that would be one of the primary takeaways from me from this, is just thinking about like, wow, I'm more connected into a system of, I'm beholden
Yeah.
to other people,
Yeah.
people that I sometimes don't know, and frankly,
Yeah.
some people that I don't really like that much.
Right.
I'm going to be beholden to these people. Like
Yeah.
I'm in a relationship with them.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another hot take on page 113. Quote, Yahweh's wrath is uniformly directed at those who mistreat the vulnerable. Uniformly. That is a heavy and strong word in this context. So are you saying that when you think of the wrath, like when we look at any times where God's wrath is either showed up or described in the Bible, it will only ever be because of what we might think of as a social abuse?
Yeah. Ooh. Oh, I'm not sure if that's what I meant by uniformly, and I used it probably imprecisely, but I wonder if it's true.
I didn't look.
So I obviously there are a lot of places where God condemns his people for worshiping other gods, but the worship of other gods always has social implications. There are always like after effects or repercussions that end up hurting the vulnerable. And so I was just teaching on Proverbs this week to my undergrad students. And I just usually pick a few Proverbs for us to think about. And one of them, I think it's from chapter 15, says, the Lord removes or breaks down the walls of the proud, but he restores the boundary stones of the widow. And this isn't even, it's not prophecy, it's not law, it's a proverb, but it's telling us what God prioritizes. He doesn't say you should look after the needs of widows, but what he says is, it's like you get this picture of God rolling up his sleeves. He's not even waiting on people to take care of widows. He's like, oh no, if you move the boundary stone of a widow, you're trying to increase your land and decrease hers. And you're thinking, well, she doesn't have anybody to, how's she going to stop me? I'm stronger than she is. I can do whatever I want. You've got God to contend with because he's the one who's going to come and pick up that stone and put it back where it goes. And so you're actually, when you take aim at or defraud someone who is vulnerable, such as a widow or fatherless or foreigner, God himself will oppose you. And we see this so powerfully in Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 through 24, where he says, foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. do not mistreat a widow or fatherless child. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry, and I will kill you with the sword so that your wife will be a widow and your children fatherless. And so this is embedded right in the middle of the laws, and God is not saying, you should institute the death penalty for anyone who does this. God's like, oh no, I'm taking care of this one. If you are the kind of person who preys on people who can't defend themselves, then you've got me to contend with. And it's so striking to me, and I've seen it over and over so many times. So I would love for somebody to write to me if they can find an example of God's wrath that is not somehow connected to mistreating the vulnerable.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder, it is, I guess in some respects, it depends on how you cook. I'm not going to say cook the books, how you interpret all of the events. So like when I think to like I don't know, you would know this offhand, but like when they've got those two mountains and they're supposed to, half of them are supposed to stand on one side, half of them
Mount
Ebal
and Mount
and
Gerizim.
whatever. And so like, I don't know all the things that they say that like, cursed will you be and the curse will you be, like, I know all the curses, but like, it's if you don't honor the law is how I think about it, at least from memory. It's just like,
but all the laws, like I've just worked through all the laws of Exodus, and the laws are about making sure that you take responsibility if you light a fire that ends up burning your neighbor's grain, or if your ox gores someone to death, or if you injure someone and they lose work time, or if you it's all about restraining. It's about inculcating this idea of social responsibility by restraining you from taking what's not yours or defrauding someone else. So it seems to me that would that could all come under the umbrella of mistreating the vulnerable.
I think I'll buy that. Like I can see it. It comes down again to this kind of the relationship between the vertical and the horizontal, and when, Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, he cheats and gives them two, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. I often kind of think that he, in some versions and translations, which I'm not adept enough to tease out, but I kind of get the idea that he's basically saying that the horizontal is an awful lot like the vertical in this respect. So loving your neighbor is like loving the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. And so it's the same kind of thing here. I think maybe what I'm hearing you say is that the pitch is that all these laws, even the ones that have like the specific details of like the kind of tassels that are supposed to be on your priestly robe where you go in there, where like all of it eventually is supposed to be towards having a respect for the Lord your God, which is actually lived out by having a just society where people who are vulnerable are actually cared for. I guess maybe that's the meta claim.
And I think it could probably be defensible that the places where it's specifically talking about God's wrath is in these cases where the vulnerable are mistreated. That's fair. That forgetting to wear your tassel is not there's not an immediate impact on the vulnerable, but if you begin to let go of God's laws, like the tassel is supposed to remind you of God's laws, if you stop meditating on these laws, you will become the kind of person who says, oh, I could probably charge her more interest and nobody would stop me.
So what was it with, somehow the strange fire when they showed up with the wrong kind of incense? He seemed like he was pretty upset. It ended up in their deaths. And so it'd be interesting to know what it was that sparked that out there. But
I do think, back to your original sentence that you said was radical, Yahweh's wrath is uniformly directed at those who mistreat the vulnerable. I think what I was trying to say is that anyone who mistreats the vulnerable is going to for sure find themselves as the recipient of God's wrath.
Okay.
So like that uniformly God's response to mistreatment will be wrath.
Good.
Not that that's the only thing that makes him full of wrath, but now I'm like curious if that might be true.
Yeah. Okay. If you're looking for a research project,
there we go.
Carmen Imes, she's at Biola University. Reach out, Talbot School of Theology. Anyway, that's not a gotcha. That's just more like I just think these are really interesting. One that just kind of smacked me in the face. Every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, this is page 127. We're praying for the end of, it says here America, but we'll say praying for the end of
Canada
country.
too.
We're praying for the end of countries, praying for the end of a country, praying for the end of our project. Every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, we're praying for the end of America and every other national entity on earth. God's kingdom is the only one that will last. Are you just trying to upset people who identify as nationalists? Well, when you say that,
This is definitely provocative. It was not original to me. I have a footnote giving credit to Joseph Lear, who was attending a conference where I was speaking, and he just got it was like time for questions from the audience, and he got up and said this into the mic, and I was like, boom, wow.
Write that down.
And his point is, he's like, I keep reminding my congregation of this because when we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done, like when we get the kingdom of God in all its fullness, there will be no more national boundaries. We'll have every tribe, tongue, and nation around the throne of God. Jesus will be king. And so to have his kingdom come actually means the end of America. America is a temporary thing. Canada is a temporary thing. That's administering, whose job is it to pave the roads and how are we going to pay for it and such things. And so I do think that there are a lot of Americans, and I suspect there are some Canadians as well, but probably not as many, who think that it's a Christian responsibility to sort of work towards a Christian government, and that God is accomplishing his will through our government to the degree that it's Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see is kind of a misordering of priorities where country becomes the main thing that we're kind of leaning into. And I just think it's temporary. It's not worth that much of our attention. Yes, be involved, vote and show up at your city council meeting and help think through how to better administer the resources that we have. But don't put all your eggs in that basket because it's all temporary. It's going to go away.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm sure you've put some thought into this. Do you distinguish between kind of like, because even like the nation state is, and I'm not a political scientist, but the nation state is a relatively, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively recent kind of innovation. But for lack of a better word, a people like that's a little bit more kind of ancient. And so when you think of like, and it's in Revelation, it's 19, it's 20, I don't know, but it's this idea of like the kings of the nations kind of bringing their wealth in.
Yeah.
I have kind of heard that preached, and I think I've interpreted it even myself when I kind of been thinking it through as that's not necessarily I don't think of it as a dissolution of whatever those entities are.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? Like more of like a, and so I wonder,
they're now subservient to.
I think so. I think it's like the European Union and and Brussels or whatever. Just the idea like that you can have kind of like a kingdom, because he's the King of Kings is how that's usually described, right?
Yes.
Right. And so, but that isn't.
I think that's possible. I think it's possible that nation states would continue only to. So this goes back to the Genesis 6 and which you mentioned earlier. And I'm thinking here of Michael Heiser and his teaching on Deuteronomy 32, and which he called the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which is to say that God appointed angelic beings over each region to administer justice in those places, and that what happened was those beings, those members of the divine council, rebelled against God's rule and tried to take the glory for themselves and went off the rails. And so that's where you get other gods that people are worshiping. These are fallen angels. And so I could imagine in God's grand scheme of things that he would want to restore a kind of regional rulership under the leadership of angels and even humans, but they would have to be fully submitted to Christ as king and not be of the rebellious sort.
Right. And so, and this is where I always get caught when I try to think through like my eschatology, because I tend to think, I think I'm more of a, I don't even know what the label is, the idea that an apocalyptic eschatology. In other words, like I think that somehow God will have to come, fully intervene, and reset things or
Mhm.
bring them to their completion. And yet I actually kind of worship in a tradition that has had historically this kind of, is it pre-mill, post-mill? I don't know what I mean. The idea that things can go up and to the right. So in other words, like we can actually work and kind of embody his kingdom here on
Yeah, I
earth a
think
little
that's
bit
more of
more.
an I think that's more of an mill
Let's go.
approach.
Yeah, sure. No,
Yeah, that
no
things
mill.
are getting better and better.
Yeah.
We're gonna keep on making this world a better place. I guess the way I see it is what we do on earth will be tested by fire, and those things that we have produced that bring true honor to God and that are worthy will last through the fire, and those things that are dumb and misguided and whatever will burn up. And so when Second Peter talks about the elements being destroyed by fire, I don't think he's talking about like the elemental building blocks of creation, but rather the things that we have built that turn out to be worldly rather than good. And so yes, I think a lot of what we build will not fare well
Yeah.
in
and
God's judgment.
Canada and or the United States may or may not be some of those things that may not fare well. Who's to say in the grand scheme
I
of it?
mean, maybe we'll be back to Turtle Island.
Let's go. But your point remains that whether it literally means the utter dissolution of these countries,
Yeah.
or what it means is the understanding that they are and always ever have been subservient to the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
The point of your book being that like we have split allegiances. Every person has split allegiances, right? But we're to be single-minded as much as possible. And it's funny, like we're in a world where people are they're becoming more suspicious of the idea of dual citizenships. I don't know. It's becoming harder and harder to have them. And I'm like, we know that there's, really negative reasons why that could be the case. But I think it's a good teaching lesson for us is to realize is that if you do, I don't think, how about this? Maybe we shouldn't have equal dual citizenships. Maybe we should have the idea that if you're going to be, you have to be a primary citizen somewhere. So where will you be a primary citizen? Will you be a primary citizen of a local country, or will you be a primary citizen of the kingdom of heaven? And I think that question, there has to be an ultimate allegiance, right? You can't, because you described earlier, if your husband and your brother ask you for something, you can't do two things. Right. You can only do one.
Do both.
You can't serve God and money. You can't serve your husband and your brother. You can probably, but you can, but not all the time. And so it's when the rubber hits the road which passport are you going to cash in?
Yes. And I am a dual citizen of the US and Canada. So maybe that's partly why I don't feel so tied to America in my heart. Like I was born and raised in the US. I didn't know I was a dual citizen until I was almost 40 years old.
Really?
Yeah, it was surprise, which was kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But I've also lived in the Philippines, and I wasn't a citizen there. I was on a temporary missionary visa. So I think living in other countries and having that different view of citizenship has helped me to say, the place I really belong is as a citizen of the kingdom of God. And although I benefit from my earthly citizenship, I mean, during COVID, we got benefits from the US and Canada. That was actually kind of sweet.
That's crazy. Yeah.
We're living in Canada, so we were getting both.
Right.
That was nice.
Sure.
But I don't feel like my ultimate allegiance can be to either of these countries, because some days they're aligned with what God would want to see happen, and some days they are not.
True story. Listen, I don't want to take any more of your time than I'm allotted. I do have one more hot button. I just want to hit all the hot buttons.
You just got all the hot. You're finding all of my poorly worded sentences.
not at all. And this is not one of those. But actually, when we spoke last time, it was just in advance. I think I mentioned at the outset, although we actually got cut off, so I don't know if it made it in there. But we spoke 4 years ago when you had just hit send on the manuscript for your being God's image book.
Yeah.
And it was so it was well in advance of it actually being published, but you were just on the heels of actually speaking at a Southern Baptist seminary at a kind of and you actually had this wonderful blog post that I'm sure I remember got a ton of traction in terms of people kind of engaging with it, which was about, hey, should I do this? If I am going to do this, what should I say? And the sticking point in some respects was, it was a lot about gender and whether or not, Carmen as a woman would even be invited to speak at that school regularly, be a part of the faculty, or be able to, let alone speak at the school, the churches that are represented by the people who are
Yeah.
there, right? So,
Yeah.
page 172 and 173 of your book that kind of came out of this idea has this wonderful kind of little insight about women in ministry with Paul. I'm not going to read any quotes. I'm going to say that last month, maybe 2 months ago now, Preston Sprinkle came out with a book from Genesis to Junia, and I thought every woman in ministry was going to be like, "Yay!" And then I was surprised to find out that some were like, "Oh, we don't like this," in some respects. And not, I don't think generally because of any of the conclusions that he drew, because
It was the framing that bothered people.
The
Yeah.
spoiler alert is that he comes down on the idea that women should be included in ministry. But yeah, so can you just? I didn't understand. I didn't.
Yeah.
Can you
Okay.
help me understand what some of the pushback was in some
Yeah.
respects?
So first of all, I really appreciate that Preston wrote the book. I don't think there was some pushback. I haven't been deep in the weeds on this, but I have heard people push back on the book because, like, suddenly the white guy who's been in complementarian circles his whole life decides to change his mind on this, and he's treating it as if he's the first one to figure this out. Like, let me tell you how this is, when there are actually decades and decades and centuries of work on this, including work by women. And how about, if you now believe that you've been wrong on this, how about an apology toward the women who've been harmed by your view? How about incorporating more women's voices and pointing to women instead of writing a book yourself? I'm more sympathetic to the fact that he wrote the book, because when he started his research, he did not know where he was going to land. And he framed it as, like, he wrote the introduction of the book before he wrote the rest of the book, which was, you, reader, probably know more than I do about where I'm going to land on this, because you've heard you've heard whatever buzz on social media. He framed it as that he was coming to this objectively because he's not a woman and he's not employed by an institution that requires him to be either complementarian or egalitarian. Therefore, he can be objective and neutral. Now, there's some truth to that. His freedom of thought on it is more than some people. If you're employed by a Southern Baptist seminary, you could lose your job over the conclusions that he drew. However, I think it sort of plays into this myth of neutrality. As if any one of us could come to a topic completely neutral. It's like not as self-aware. And it also implies that if I did such a study, because I'm a woman, therefore I would not be able to do this objectively. So it sort of casts doubt on the legitimacy of any woman's claim on this issue, because of her gender, she can't be disinterested in it. She has like a dog in the fight.
Right.
And so I think from what I can tell, that's what's bothering women about the book.
That's fair.
But I feel like we need as many people as possible to explore this issue and to talk about what they've learned. So I'm delighted that Preston took the time to study it. I'm grateful that he landed where he did and that he's willing to say it all publicly, because although he thinks that there are no implications, like he's coming from a neutral place, I believe actually that there are consequences, and he will be feeling those consequences for years to come. People who would have invited him to speak at a conference, and now he's not one of us anymore, so we can't invite him. And I think he'll feel that. I haven't heard him talk about whether that's already happening, but there are people for whom this is such a strong litmus test of biblical faithfulness that he is sure to get heat. And he's not he's no stranger to controversy. He tends to study the things that are especially controversial. So he'll weather it fine. But I do think it's probably that his idea of being neutral was overblown.
That's fair. I appreciate you giving that kind of as a bit of a sketch. I was just a little bit like, I guess in my mind, I thought, and this is probably naive, but I thought the people who remain unconvinced,
Yeah.
they're probably not going to be convinced by this book, truthfully. But they would actually maybe read it because a man wrote it.
Yep,
and so I
exactly.
thought,
And this is why I think men and women should be writing on this.
Right. I kind of thought like the idea, like, you can't talk about this because you're not a woman. I was like, I feel like that's a kind of a slippery slope that we probably don't want to go down that,
No,
that rabbit
absolutely
trail.
not.
But yeah.
So I just wrote a book with Nijay Gupta. He wrote the book Tell Her Story, which is all about women in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, and how they led. And I read the book. I think it's a great book. I'm so glad that Nijay's lending his voice to it. He also began in a complementarian context and shifted as he studied the scriptures. It was the Bible that convinced him. So he and I have just written a children's book that highlights 25 women of the Bible. And I do the Old Testament women. He does the New Testament women. Great to work with him on it. He's a part of hosting a new podcast with IVP called Hear Women. And I think, yes, we need men to be involved in the process of amplifying women's voices, thinking about issues that affect women. I'm very glad he and Preston Sprinkle are both passionate about this issue.
Good. And it's to circle it back, and then we'll leave it here, is that it's about sibling relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, often, so many of our relationships are kind of bound up in sexuality in some respects. So like, like how, but I can't remember the quote from Paul, but like treat certain people like this, treat old men as though you're fathers, treat old women as though you're your mothers. And then it's treat women and meant like as though they're your siblings. Right. And so like, and then you say, okay, well, how did siblings show up in the Bible? And then you see like, I mean, when so-and-so got taken advantage of sexually in the Old Testament, people came in and they like, burned the town down, burned the town down because they were like, you know what, this is how important sibling relationships are to us. And so like the idea that we should be kind of like in that kind of relationship with people should reframe the way you think about it. So becoming God's family, why the church still matters. As a pastor, I actually surprisingly do find myself trying to convince people that church matters. And so now we have an excellent printed and audio resource that can help also be a kind of a partner in the fight. Dr. Imes, thank you again for everything that you've been doing. It's just been, we really appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Thanks for your enthusiasm about the book. Thanks for being part of the launch team and for taking the time to interview me. You had great questions and we only got to like a third of them. And I'm sorry, time went so fast.
It goes by. It goes by.
Yeah, it does.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.